Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back. I hope those of you who took advantage of the tour of the Rosa Parks Museum enjoyed your experience. Please, we'd love to hear your feedback, how we can make that better, as we're committed to being good stewards of that. Well, it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Ambassador Robert Hunter, former ambassador to NATO, but many more things. You have his bio. You actually, most of you I know were in this room and you heard his bio. So I'm going to do something a little bit here. I'm going to highlight just a few things that bio, one that I don't think is in this bio, but you may, it's an indicator of something that I wanted to highlight. This gentleman has written over 1,000 publications, including articles, books, editorials, and I think it's indicative, and those of you who had a chance to interact with him, I had the great pleasure of having dinner with him last night. A couple of things. One, a boundless energy that is, never stops. It's just always on, and you sense that, and it's a very positive energy, and it manifests itself in things like that. The writing of so many publications, but not just that, it manifests itself in the activity, the involvement that he has at every level and in everything that means something to him. So he is one of the people who doesn't just write or talk, he acts. And he has acted in this country's interest all his life and done incredible things as he has. The other thing that you notice about him is he likes people, and he has an insatiable curiosity about the human experience, and is always interested in who people are, what they're doing, and what their lives are like, and that comes out. All of this well suits him and explains, perhaps in part, how his great success in his career as a diplomat and in other capacities for this country and for various presidents. He'll be leaving here and going to see President Carter, which kind of tells you a little bit about this man and the kind of people that he's been close to and has served. At this time, it is my great honor to bring up our former ambassador to NATO, Ambassador Robert Hunter. Thank you, sir.
Let me see if I can get rid of this so I can have a little space. Well, General, I thank you very much for that. All I got to say is after that introduction, I can't wait to hear what I have to say. It's a very talented group of people here. I've learned from the time here earlier today. Students, faculty, serving people, retired people, all kinds. A lot of talent down here. Always has been. There are some people here I've had the honor of working with. Bob Bell, if you want to know anything really going on at NATO, ask him. I've told him he has to write his autobiography so that people remember what NATO was and is going to continue to be. And a member of my team from NATO, when I served there, Bainbridge Cowell, I'm not going to embarrass him too much, but I'm going to say the following. He had an ancestor for whom he is named, who was an inspiration for the Marine Corps hymn. Right? Uh-oh. I'm not going to go any further on that. It might be an embarrassing part, but that's true. Wonderful honor to be here at what is truly a great university, Troy University, and to experience the association with some amazing people. I have one great disappointment I have to tell you about. When I had dinner with the general and last night, I came down especially to have shrimp and grits, and they'd run out of shrimp, so I'm going to have to wait to have grits at another time. Say something else. I just had the honor to go to that museum across the street. It's changed a lot since I was first here visiting Maxwell a number of years ago, and it's for those of you who have not been there, it's a very humbling experience. It's a very hopeful experience too, and it also connects to NATO. Because what happened with regard to our country and done by Americans in regard to what Rosa Parks and others did from that period onward also is very inspiring for what this country does in protecting its security abroad and our engagement in NATO. And there's a quality about the American people when we get pushed to it and get going that nobody stands in the way. And in fact, if I can, I wasn't planning to be so quite affected by it because it was quite changed from what it was before, even though I lived through a bit of that history from the Washington perspective. And I'm going to steal a line from a favorite Yankee of a lot of us. Folks here are going to little note nor long remember what I say here, but they're never going to forget what she did here. Rosa Parks. And that's, and as somebody said, there is more monuments here in this city to progress in racial relations than there is anywhere else in the United States. And it continues to be one of the great challenges in this country, as according to the Constitution, we the people of the United States in order to create a more perfect union. It's an experiment, just like NATO is a continuing experiment. Now, some institutions grow old and they die. The League of Nations, for example, sat around a long time. Hard to kill off an institution. League of Nations went out of business, you won't believe this, on the 26th of April, 1946, after the war it failed to protect. The NATO could have gone out of business on Christmas Day in 1991. I don't know, Bob, whether you were in NATO at that point. That's when they were having a thing called then the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council, which brought together all the countries that belonged to a thing called the OSCE. You don't even know what that was, including the Soviet Union and countries from Eastern Europe. And they had all the ambassadors and that sort of thing, and the ministers, foreign ministers. I was not there at the time. And they were having the family photo. Everybody knows what a family photo is. And during the family photo, a hand reached through the curtain and took hold of the flag of the Soviet Union and took it out and replaced it with a flag of the Federation of Russia. Because at that moment, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. A stunning thing. When I grew up in this business, I thought the Soviet Union was going to last forever. A lot of people thought the Cold War was going to go forever, and suddenly it was gone. In fact, on the first of the 9/11s, the Europeans, stupid Europeans, they write their dates backwards. So that was the 9th of November, 1989, when the Berlin Wall opened. Nobody expected it to happen. I was at a meeting that morning with all the great and the good, and we knew stuff was going to happen in Central Europe. People predicted everything was going to happen, but nobody mentioned the possibility of the Berlin Wall opening, and we were right for 4 whole hours. And that began what I call the holiday from history. When the United States thought we had no more threats from abroad, we got back the sanctuary of the two broad oceans that we had lost on December 7th, 1941. We had it back again. And then on our 9/11, we realized that the United States could never abstain from the outside world. The outside world was going to come to us in a threatening way, however much we hoped and prayed it was going to be somewhere else if it happened like that. All right, so 70 years for NATO. That's just a number. I'm a little bit older than 70. I'm not going to say that. Only my wife knows for sure. And I even lie to her sometimes. I say I'm a bit younger. But so what? It's 70. The point is whether it continues to have a set of purposes, ambitions, ideals, and deals with the reality of the facts of power and the facts of security. And the answer on that is a fantastic yes. Could you recreate NATO today out of whole cloth? As I said earlier, I doubt it, because it takes a lot of effort to do it. As I said earlier, could you recreate the Bill of Rights? That may be hard to do too. But the fact is you have it and you preserve what's the best. Is it still relevant? Absolutely. That's been asked many times, not just in 1981, but even today. some people who should know better continue to say it. NATO is in crisis. And it's always been in crisis. And I guess maybe if it weren't in crisis, people wouldn't be working at the requirements, the details, and the possibilities. At one point, I remember a friend of mine who was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, some folks here will know that, Bob Bell will know what that is, got so sick of writing memoranda when he was in the Defense Department at this moment of grave crisis in NATO's history that he literally had a rubber stamp made up. And he would bang that at the top of the memoranda. When I became NATO, he gave me a copy of that. Well, when did he do that? 1967. True then, true later on, but so what? It's still relevant, but not on its own. NATO, as was said by one of my very smart colleagues earlier today, has been the lead agency for America's continuing commitment and engagement in Europe since the 1940s and continuing there. But it's not been alone. It's been part of a lot of other things. Security, I'm going to make clear, I hope, is organic, involved of a lot of different elements. I'm going to start with my conclusions first, some personal bottom lines. NATO is robust and will continue. Also, the thing called the liberal international order, that is also robust and will continue. Why? Because it is consonant with the facts of life in our self-interest. Incidentally, NATO, other things we do, other things we do abroad, are in our self-interest. Foreign policy, here it comes, big word, is not an eleemosynary institution. It's about doing things that matter because they matter. And because they matter, they carry on. Just as this country, another experiment, is going to carry on as difficult as it may seem at times under any administration. And whether this is more difficult now than any other, I'll let individuals here judge. I wouldn't dare. I got my own views, but I think I'll keep them for myself. Benjamin Franklin once said, was asked when the Constitution was done, he said, "What kind of government you got?" And he said, you probably know this, "It is a republic if you can keep it." And every generation of Americans has to answer that question. All right, the NATO purpose, I would say it's evergreen. It changes, but I'm going to tell you what NATO is really about. Here it comes. I'll state it very simply. And this is beyond anything the Russians do. This was true even if there were not a Putin, and even if there weren't not a challenge from Russia as there is today. It's very simple. NATO's job is to, in regard to the North Atlantic area at least, if not beyond, and I think increasingly or decreasingly, it's not going to be much beyond. Because as was said earlier, we're back to collective defense more than projecting power and purpose elsewhere for a whole variety of reasons. It's very simple. NATO's role is to lead in promoting security, stability, and confidence among the allies and partners. Is to help people, as much as anything, have the confidence in the face of a difficult world, and it's getting more complicated, if not more difficult. It's always been that way. To give people the confidence to get on with their own lives. I'll leap ahead and say something. When we went from a thing called Partnership for Peace, which Spain will remember, and Bob will remember, to people wanted to join NATO. And we said, well, wait a second, you don't, Central European countries, and some represented here, you really don't need to join NATO. You've got Partnership for Peace that helps you transform things. You got the European Union. And they said, wait a second. Our history, Germany since 1933, Central Europe since the late 1940s, what we've been through, we need to feel a sense of security to get on with our lives. And that means NATO membership. Because that is the Article 5 commitment, about which I'm going to say a number of things. Security is an amalgam, not just NATO, and I'll talk about the details. And the final thing in my bottom line, it's what this generation and the generations represented in this room do that is going to be most critical. When was in the White House doing these things under Jimmy Carter in 1977 when I had responsibilities for NATO, et cetera. I invented a term I called the successor generation. Bob, thank you for using it earlier today. And what I meant by the successor generation is, what do you do to carry on with security and responsibilities with people who don't remember the Second World War? And we now pass to a time, what I call the successor to the successor generation. What do you do when the people coming into maturity don't remember the Cold War? Right now, I dare say there is not a single student at Troy University who was alive during the Cold War. The day the Cold War ended, the day the Berlin Wall came up, and I was teaching a course at Chesapeake College with a colleague from Europe, and I talked about the day the Berlin Wall went up, and all people were staring at me, and I had to realize not a single one of them had been alive 10,351 days earlier when the wall went up. So it's your responsibility, or to be you students and others here, if I may say so, your generation, this has been said before, but I'll say it again, your generation has the responsibility for correcting all the mistakes that my generation made. All right, basic analysis, start with history. U.S. interests and democratic values are more consistent than they are variable. Yes, they change over time, but they're actually very consistent. And what are these interests and values? From the late 1890s, we have been a two-ocean country. In fact, there are only two allies, which are both Atlantic and Pacific nations. We're one, Canada is the other. Though the Canadians sniff and they say, we're the only three-ocean ally. A thing called the Arctic, which we recognize it. Well, actually, we are too. I'm sorry. We're three-ocean too. I hope there's nobody here from Alaska that I just insulted. Strategy developed over time. The critical decision actually was taken about Europe in 1940 by Franklin Roosevelt, when there was a question. Here was Japan doing things in China, and here were things that Hitler and Mussolini doing in Europe. It was very likely we were going to get drawn into war. Where do we set our priorities? And in April 1940, the president took a decision. It's going to be Europe. Not just because they were democratic, not just because they were most of them the ones we were going to be defending, but also because without the security, the prosperity, and the independence of Europe, nothing else was going to matter very much. And so what we did is, after we were attacked in Pearl Harbor, but that was put into a kind of a placeholder, despite all the suffering and the fighting that went on there, until the job got done in Europe, and then the resources got moved to Asia. I think it was the correct decision. Now, we're here to talk about changing the priorities to Asia. Some people talked about the pivot to Asia. Others talked about rebalancing to Asia. And when President Obama got caught up on that, he said, well, now, wait a second, pivot. He said, I'm a basketball player. He said, pivot, he said, that means when you plant your foot one place, and then you'll be able to move the other foot somewhere else. He said, and my basic foot that I'll pivot around is Europe. In fact, he also said that, as I said earlier, and some of you weren't here, he said, there's anything you want to do in the world that's worth doing, it's better to do them with the North Atlantic allies, partners, and friends than to do it without them. And that's true, no matter what we want to do anywhere. Whether we're going to get the kind of help we want in Asia from Europeans is very much moot at the moment. In fact, I have serious doubts about it. We're going to have to take the primacy. And hopefully we're going to do it in a way in which we and the Chinese don't end up with a Cold War. Because we all understand what the prices and costs of Cold War were from the last time we had it. It had to go on for a while. Did it have to go on for quite so long? I'm not so sure. So, okay. Facts keep us pinned to Europe. Why? Number one is geography. Number two is economics, politics, culture, and the fact we have competing powers. One reason we get along with the Europeans, despite the fact we have some problems with the European Union and there's talk about trade and all that, is the deep American economic engagement in Europe and theirs with us. It is the deepest, other than with Canada, economic relationship we have is with the European Union, the deepest. And in fact, unlike China, where we have a terrible imbalance in their favor, it's more or less balanced as between us and the Europeans. We would be stupid if we allowed anything to happen to that. Now, U.S. grand strategy in regard to Europe was set on the 4th of April, 1917, the day we declared war on Germany. It's been very simple. Most important is to prevent the emergence of a hostile hegemon in Europe. We had three: Kaiser's Germany, Hitler's Germany, and the Soviet Union of Stalin and his successors. Now there's a potential fourth hegemon, which is the European Union. I think we can handle that. Now, not everybody is totally convinced of that, and we do sometimes play one off against another, and we have a little problem here, a little bit there. There's still a question about whether we could tolerate having a Europe-only army as opposed to just being NATO. We've fought that now for 30 or 40 years. The answer is, of course we do. Of course we want to have them doing more. And when the president says the Europeans should do more for themselves, why not? Why not? In fact, one of the little secrets people don't understand when they complain about the European Union having its only military capability, little secret is this: countries only have one army. They don't build two armies. We do have this thing where, if need be, the European Union, was Western European Union, is now an alphabet soup kind of thing, and they keep changing the name. If they want to borrow the army, so they can borrow the army. Can I have the keys to the army tonight? With a proviso that if NATO needs it, NATO gets first call. And everybody agrees to that. And it makes a lot of sense. Because whatever the European Union military, if it gets going, does in places like Africa and other places, saving us having to do it, if it comes down to security in Europe against anything important, only NATO can do it, and it cannot be done except with the United States. You know, after 9/11, when we went to Afghanistan, we got it turned over eventually to NATO. Every single NATO ally sent troops to Afghanistan, including Iceland. Doesn't even have military forces. Sent a doctor and a couple of nurses, a bunch of other partners, that sort of thing. Now, did they go to Afghanistan because they love us? Because they were all worried that otherwise the Taliban was going to come to Western Europe? No. They came for a very simple reason, which is not often spoken but well understood. They understood that there was one task in Europe, even at that point, and certainly now, that cannot be resolved in security terms without us, and that's the future of Russia. They were worried after 9/11 that we might lose interest in Europe. On 9/12, they invoked Article 5 of the NATO treaty, the one for all, the Three Musketeers provision, one for all and all for one. For the first and only time in NATO's history, they invoked it without asking us because they were afraid we were then, because we'd been attacked for the first time, except for Pancho Villa, since 1812, leaving aside that recent unpleasantness we went through from 1861 to 1865. Notable, as we've been talking, that if we came to 1918, would the South join the rest of the country in fighting in Europe? The answer was absolutely yes. And in fact, if you look for a greater commitment regionally to being a member of the United States military services, you find it more in this region of the country than anywhere else. Fine. So that was just that recent unpleasantness. Okay. What happened after post-World War II? Again, security was an amalgam. The first thing that happened was the Marshall Plan. You had to rebuild these societies that had been destroyed. We were the only serious country involved in the Second World War that was not directly attacked. The arsenal of democracy. All the others were, though not all were invaded. Marshall Plan, which incidentally was not just government, was also private sector. In fact, throughout our security and other involvements in Europe, it is not just government, it's also the private sector, the not what we call non-governmental organizations, and the American people, seeing for a variety of reasons how much our being able to continue being what we are depends on what happens with regard to Europe. Then it became political strategic after Stalin consolidated his position in Central Europe, and the North Atlantic Treaty was signed in Washington on the 4th of April in 1949. But even then, it was not militarized. It was only after the start of the Korean War that it was understood that this was going to be could be a military battle as well as anything else. In fact, Allied Command Europe, which still exists, didn't come into being until 2 years less 2 days after the North Atlantic Treaty was signed. And one of the first things that we did to make HCE, which still exists, real, is the President of the United States set Dwight D. Eisenhower, General of the Army, as the first SACEUR. As people said, he was worth at least 2 divisions because it underscored the United States' commitment to European security, prosperity in the future. Absolutely important. Since 1949, and incidentally, simultaneously, it's already been mentioned, the Europeans were self-organizing into what is today the European Union. Started out even before NATO did and has carried on since then. Treaty of Rome in 1959, they built on it ever since. They got their growing pains and still have them, but let me let you on a little wager. Don't bet against the success of NATO. Don't bet against the success of the European Union, and by God, never bet against the success of the United States. Since 1949, irreducible features: the U.S. strategic commitment, common perception of threats and challenges, Article 5, and also Article 6. Article 5 is where you will where you will consider an attack on one as an attack on all. So in that article, it doesn't say you go to war. It says each country will decide through its own purposes what it will do. Very important. We put that as a limitation. Article 6 limits the geographic area because we didn't want to get stuck with defending colonial possessions of some of the European powers, and also to make sure that the American people would accept the first ever U.S. strategic commitment in writing to a foreign power since 1786 with the French. As I mentioned earlier, we then declared war on France, but fortunately they didn't take us up on it. They had something else to worry about. The Allied commands. Now, people who have served don't always know what this is about, but NATO has 2 official languages, French and English. 1 practical language, American, number 1. Number 2, the only fully integrated international military command system that there's ever been. And right now that is, if I can get the number of NATO allies, I guess it's 29 out of 30. Iceland doesn't belong. France didn't for a while. So France never left the North Atlantic Treaty. They always wanted that protection, even though they had some reasons for a period of time not being part of the military side until I convinced them it was probably a good idea. And they convinced me that being for a European army was not such a bad idea. And we cut a deal, the French ambassador and I. It took a while to implement it. Also, common standards, interoperability, so that you can go around and you can make NATO equipment from virtually any country work with anybody else's equipment. Now, lots of people make different things because each country wants a piece of the action for its industry. Got to have an industrial thing. But it is absolutely astounding. I remember once we had an American Navy pilot, any Navy people here, I don't know, who came into the NATO headquarters. He said, I was flying helicopters out of Aviano. We had one of our people had gone down in the Drake. We were trying to find him. He said, we're running out. It was losing daylight. Couldn't go back to Aviano and refuel and come back again. I looked down, there was this old rust bucket there from one of the NATO countries, old rust bucket. It was not tanker, but freighter, okay. I called them up on a standard NATO frequency. They had a standard NATO helipad. I landed. They had standard NATO fuel and a standard NATO nozzle. I refueled from that rust bucket, and I went out and found our pilot. It's never happened before. Still continues, and it's still going to continue. Also, they have a consensus principle at NATO. Whenever the North Atlantic Council meets, which is the governing body of NATO, and I had the honor of in permanent session, meaning ambassadors to represent the United States. It could be at ministerial level or heads of state and government when they show up for summits. They never take a vote. It's always by unanimity. Anybody can stand up and say no, and it falls, which means that if there is ever an agreement at the North Atlantic Council to take a military action, everybody has signed on to it, and guess what? No ally has ever failed to respond. Some with less enthusiasm than others. I recall at the time when we were involved in one of these things, I was out of government then, I think it might have been Kosovo, where the Greeks didn't like it because of their relationship with the Serbs, but they didn't block it. And the issue, and somebody, I was in a meeting with the Greek ambassador in Washington, Greek foreign minister, and they said, surely you're having trouble with what NATO's doing using Thessalonica to transship things for NATO. Don't you have a problem with that with your public opinion? He said, I don't have any problem with my public opinion. Everybody's against it. But they didn't fall off the wagon. Nobody ever has. So both the day after 9/11 and in Afghanistan, the Allies were with us more than anything else because of the need to have America involved. And that's the way it is today, too. And that is unchanging. All right, so NATO is the shield. The sword, as much as anything, was caused by the transformation of individual West European countries, the economic prosperity, political democratization, which took a while. But when NATO started, one of the allies, Portugal, was a dictatorship. Well, we took them in. Why? Because we needed the Azores in order to fly across to Europe. Well, they then had a revolution in 1974, no problem. We didn't take in Spain until after Franco died, even though it might have been useful to have them when we had certain little arrangements there. Economic, political, cultural, all integrated, and security and engagement are, well, I'm going to use a big word, organic. All the parts have to go together. All right, why did the Cold War come to an end? As much as anything else, not only the shield held, but as communications, other thing went up, a lot of people on the other side realized what they were missing. Gorbachev tried to preserve communism and preserve the Soviet Union by having some openness, glasnost, and having some transformation, perestroika. And when it came to openness, and he said, now I want you to talk about the protect communism. And they said, thank you very much, General Secretary. We want to talk about some other stuff. And it was amazing how fast the Soviet internal and external empires came to an end. The most profound end to any empire in peacetime ever in all of history. It was amazing how it collapsed. All right, from 1989 to NATO did not come to an end. Why? Number one, it was inertia. Day after the notional end of the Cold War, everybody came to work as usual. That never happened before. At the end of the Second World War, with the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe, VE Day, May the 8th, or the 9th if you were a Russian, SHAEF, Eisenhower's command, dissolved on the 26th of July, 1945. No, at NATO, inertia, everybody came to work as usual because of all these things that work together. NATO standards, STANAGs, the relationship of the defense industries, all of this apparatus that had been built up that worked. Anybody here have served in Afghanistan? You go to Kabul, to the headquarters there when NATO was involved, and you'd listen to people, and everybody doing the same stuff. 28, well, it was then about 21 allies, all doing the same stuff, and all of them English, And if you didn't look at their patch on the sleeve or look at what food they were allowed to eat, the French by far had the best cuisine, you wouldn't know what country they were from. That's the way it works, the way it worked together. Also, after the end of the Cold War, there was a desire not to repeat what happened after World War I, or even after World War II, when we pulled everybody out, almost all, to come home, and the Soviet Union did not disarm. And so there was this big overhang in Central Europe, then called Eastern Europe. The Polish joke was we used to be in Eastern Europe, and then they moved our country 200 kilometers to the west, and we found ourselves in, I'm sorry, we used to be in Central Europe, then they moved our country 200 kilometers to the west, we found ourselves in Eastern Europe. It's a Polish joke. Yeah, I don't know if the Polish folks are still here. There you go, right? Good Polish joke. If you want to get a good joke, go to the Poles. They're wonderful at it. Having suffered as much as the Poles have, humor being a function of suffering. Now, here's how I'm going to get sort of partisan. You've probably already figured out what my politics are. The last outstanding president we had when he took office who really understood what foreign policy was about and security was about was George H.W. Bush, who used his vice presidency very intelligently. He gave a speech in Mainz, Germany in May of 1989, in which he said our goals would be to try to create a Europe whole and free. And then they had the words, and at peace. That's what 8 words. That is a grand strategy. What was it about? It was to prevent what happened after the First World War, when in the Treaty of Versailles, in clause 231, as we heard from the very smart lady from Troy University, required Germany to take all responsibility for World War I, which of course was nonsense. And it was drafted in part by John Foster Dulles, which just he had to then straighten things out later on for the trouble he caused, young lawyer. And they did that in order to have reparations against Germany. You had to have a factual basis for that. Well, George H.W. Bush was determined, if at all possible, we weren't going to do that with Russia. Russia, Soviet Union, lost the Cold War. He never said it. And made very sure in that administration, when I served in Clinton, we never said that they'd lost the Cold War. What we would say is, everybody won it, because we got out of it. We survived the nuclear standoff, which could have ended the world. That's what the nuclear standoff was. People forget that American nuclear strategy in Europe throughout the Cold War was a suicide pact. We agreed that if indeed there were a serious Warsaw Pact attack into Western Europe, after a certain pause, et cetera, we would initiate the use of nuclear weapons. That would have been the end of the world. Suicide pact. It was never called to account because the Russians weren't stupid. Well, we had a few hairy moments, and hopefully we never get back to that. So both Bush and Clinton went on to implement this grand strategy. Europe whole and free and at peace. Very simple. What were the elements? Number one, I already said it, the United States to remain as a European power. European power. Preserve Allied Command Europe, Allied Command Atlantic and Norfolk at that time, now then replaced with Allied Command Transformation, where I had a chance to be a senior concept developer, whatever that means, including when Jim Mattis was there and was an outstanding commander. And then the German problem. The German problem started in the 1860s, where this agglomeration came together, easily the most powerful country in Europe, and was a problem for a long time afterwards. 2 wars, World War I and World War II. Now I have to tell you something. During the Cold War, we in the Soviet Union disagreed on almost everything. Something we did not disagree on was keeping Germany divided. Now, we used to say, oh, we wanted a united Germany. We were lying. There was a great Frenchman who said during that period, and Franco-German relations have always been difficult, he said, I love Germany. I love it so much I want 2 of them. Well, so we had to find a way to keep the German problem going. So what happened It's when the Cold War came to an end, it was inevitable Germany was going to become one country. Well, where should it rest? The Russians, it was the Soviet Union and then the Russian Federation, accepted the following in writing, that united Germany could be part of NATO. Why? Because the United States would be able to keep watch over it. Okay? When it came time for NATO enlargement, who was going to be the first members? Chancellor Kohl of Germany had a great idea. Others accepted it. We accepted it. What you do is you start off with two countries, Poland and the Czech Republic. And throw in Hungary because they were part of a thing called Visegrad, just for window dressing. Why, those two? Not only because they were between the West and Russia, but they surrounded Germany. So that if indeed the Germans then got what they had used to do, even though the chance of doing it was zero, they'd have on the east, they'd have NATO next to them and be part of it. That's why the euro was created, the currency, as much as anything. The Deutschmark was going to dominate Central Europe, but oh, you don't want that, that's Germany. So they created this thing called the euro, which is still as much as anything run out of the German economy, but hey, that's not Germany. This sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But memories and history are terribly important. Now, what else? Central Europe, as we call it, the proximate cause of three great wars. World War I, beginning in Sarajevo, but a lot of other things. World War II, after the end of the war, Soviet occupation, and then in the Cold War and afterwards, how do you deal with Central Europe? You've got to take it off the geopolitical chessboard so that it will no longer be in contention with people playing games with regard to Central Europe. And the first thing was Partnership for Peace, which was this amazing thing that was developed for the militaries of the NATO countries to go and work with the militaries in these other countries to make them the lead agency for the democracy and reform of those countries. And during that period, I don't know whether I said this earlier, I may have said this to some other people, the United States Air Force in Europe, still very significant at that time, during this period, 50% of all the time spent by U.S. Air Force personnel in Europe was spent in Central European countries to help transform their militaries. General George Jallowen came up with this other idea, which was talked about earlier. Why don't we pair National Guards of individual American states with the militaries of Central European countries? Well, no surprise, Illinois got Poland, okay, because of Chicago and Warsaw, and Romania got Alabama. All right, that's fantastic. Romania, incidentally, was the very first Central European country to ask for NATO membership. Their transformation, their desire to be part of NATO was fantastic. And there are people here who go to Romania all the time now, and because that works, because what our citizen soldiers, if that's the right word, and the National Guards do with these countries is absolutely fantastic. Okay, I mentioned enlargements and why it was done, to give people the confidence. At one point there was a meeting, I don't know if the Lithuanian and the Latvian are still here. There was a meeting in Washington, the three presidents, and somebody said to the three presidents, was Brzezinski actually asked, who always asks tough questions. He said, if you were given a choice, would you rather join the European Union or NATO? And they looked around and said, okay, you answer, Charlie. And he said, NATO. He said, why? Because NATO is the strategic commitment of the United States. And it also gets us to the European Union. We join the European Union, maybe or maybe not, we get the United States. Well, that's what the people wanted, okay. Now, the biggest problem was, what about Russia? Because the Russians didn't like enlargement. They didn't like NATO coming closer to them. They accepted, as I said, what happened with Germany. But when it came to the first enlargements of Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary, the Russians did not like it, but they lumped it. because they recognized it was in their strategic interest. They have not liked a lot of other enlargements, and in fact, one of the questions is whether NATO has already enlarged too far for our own good. I happen to think we have gone too far. It's irreversible now. And when the President of the United States says, would American soldiers want to go in the defense of Montenegro, it's a moot point, right? Who's going to invade Montenegro? The Russians aren't. By the time they get to Montenegro, they've got to be a lot of blood all over the floor, and we'd be involved anyway. Well, maybe one of its neighbors, but we'd find a way to finesse that. But he was asking the right question, which shows, in a way, we shouldn't have gone that far. Now, the Russians couldn't care less about Montenegro, but they care about some others. 2008, one of the things we did wrong is we didn't take sufficiently seriously legitimate Russian interests of how do you prevent them doing what Germany did after World War I, which is revanchism. How do you prevent that? Well, as we were about to take people into NATO in 1997, folks came up, let's work out something special with the Russians. NATO-Russia Founding Act, 17th of May, 1997. Look it up. So they're all on the internet. And it has a number of common cooperative things. It's got 19 areas of cooperation in it, all good things, and some self-limiting provisions, which NATO did on its own. Couldn't negotiate that with the Russians. Oh, well, you can't do that. Among other things, it says no NATO country nuclear weapons in Central Europe. Okay. Number two, it said under certain circumstances, we're going to meet all our responsibilities without putting bases and troops in Central Europe. Well, we're doing that now because the circumstances changed. It was very tightly written. And that created a NATO-Russian Permanent Joint Council, and later a NATO-Russia Council, in which Russians came into the NATO building. And at first, it was the NATO allies on one side and the Russians on another. That didn't work. So now, theoretically, the NATO-Russia Council, everybody's sitting around the same table, and everybody with the right of veto. Well, since the invasion of Crimea, it's been more or less a dead letter, even though it still meets. Well, then what do you do about Ukraine? Ukraine is neither east nor west. It's got a mixed population, and it was recognized that it was right up against the Russian frontier. And you really couldn't bring it into NATO, but you couldn't leave it to Russian tender mercies. So we created a very special relationship with Ukraine with the NATO-Ukraine Charter and Council. I had the privilege of negotiating that. Incidentally, when we were trying to figure out what name to have, and my Ukrainian counterparts saying, well, I don't know what we should call it. And I said, well, we offered with the Russian thing a charter for the NATO-Russia relationship. He says, well, we'll take that, because the Russians had turned it down. Okay. Special thing with regard to the three Baltic states, because we had never recognized their incorporation into the Soviet Union under the Nazi-Soviet Pact. So that's a special case. And even though the Russians hate that, they've had to understand it. And that, if there's going to be a problem, is going to be the test case, whether it's military action or cyber, energy, a whole series of things, hybrid warfare. Incidentally, hybrid warfare is about 3,500 years old, but we got to have a new name for it. Got new circumstances. But then how much farther do you do? All right, there were some other things that were done, including an agreement that NATO and the Western European Union, as it then was, would find a way to work together and not be in conflict with one another, with the WEU being allowed to borrow the Army. And a lot of Americans won't know the following. But if indeed WEU, totally now European Union, had borrowed the military forces, which don't belong to NATO, they belong to countries. It's only when you have something to do, you ask countries, please, can I have a battalion of this, a battalion of that? Under those things, the United States agreed that we would provide American assets to work for the European Union under EU command, because they didn't have any air left. I don't think we ever told the Congress that, but that's all right. Now, all of this was done, but there was a problem. It's called Bosnia. 200,000 people had died. We had tried for 2 years to get NATO air power used to stop the killing in Bosnia. A lot of agreements. There was deny flight, which to prevent the use of aircraft anywhere over Bosnia, in which NATO flew 100,263 sorties. That's a lot of flying, a lot of training. We had a thing where the UN forces on the ground, which were never given enough to do things with, but if they got in trouble, they could ask for NATO to help. That was never done. And a third thing was to defend the so-called safe areas. When the Bosnian Serbs, were killing people, would NATO come to the rescue with air power? Well, unfortunately, the French didn't like that and kept us from doing it. And the British, for 2 years, wouldn't let us do it. Until after Srebrenica, with that slaughter of 8,000 people, and after we got NATO's future organized. At that point, as one of my colleagues out of government said, what's the point of having NATO if you can't stop the most serious fighting in Europe since World War II? At that point, it was decided NATO could use air power. Everybody agreed. And in an 18-day air campaign, the war was over. And then they created, after Dayton, a thing called the Implementation Force, I-4. Significant thing about I-4, everybody got involved. The Russians said, we want to be involved. This is the only action going on, and we approved this kind of thing. Their military want to be involved. But we can't be involved under NATO command. That is evil. That's where we follow this thing. And so General Jawan said, and Bill Perry, the Secretary of Defense, that's an interesting thing. What if you would be under United States command? Oh, well, the United States has been the superpower. We're still kind of equal with them, et cetera, et cetera. Sure, we'll be under United States command just as long as we're not under NATO command. They said, fine, so we worked it out. It just happened to be the commander of the NATO forces and the commander of the American forces happened to be the same person. Okay, General Jawan, but it worked. It worked. All right, then we had a number of problems. After 9/11, the United States strategic concerns shifted. And so I wanted to describe some of that. I've described what happened when we were in Afghanistan with regard to NATO. And then the worst crisis in NATO's history was the United States-led invasion of Iraq, 2003. The consequences of which we are still suffering from this very day. This very day. Still suffering from that. The British joined us. The British Prime Minister paid a heavy price for that, Tony Blair. The French and Germans were against it. And of course, public opinion was so bad that the United States Congress stopped serving French fries. They had to call them freedom fries. Okay. And we finally made it up with them. But that crisis is still going out there because that was an unprovoked thing. It was the dumbest thing I think we've done in the modern era. And we're still living with the consequences of that. And among other things, it more than anything else stimulated a flow of refugees into Europe, which is a major thing for provoking maybe the worst crisis the European Union's ever had. Not just the people coming from Central Europe, people coming from Africa, in part because of the attack on Libya, but more people from south of the Sahara. People still coming today. In fact, the Turks, when there was this fight a few weeks ago with Mr. Erdogan about what they were going to be allowed to do to the Kurds, and he said, you know, to the Europeans, if you don't behave on this, I'm going to open the camps and send 1 million refugees out of the Middle East in the camps in Turkey, and I'm going to flood Europe with them. That's what he said 3 weeks ago. Well, that all came from that. I've already mentioned maybe too much enlargement, but the real one and then there was the Libyan matter, which maybe getting rid of Gaddafi was a good thing, but then we all walked away from it. Walked away from it. NATO and the European Union did almost nothing of substance to help the Libyans. Bad thing. Then came the Russians in Crimea in February 1914. Our hands weren't exactly clean. There was no excuse for what he did. It was aggression, pure and simple. But of course, I have to mention that while The Russians were trying to pull Ukraine in their direction. We were trying to pull Ukraine in our direction. So much so that the Assistant Secretary of State, probably without authority, got on the telephone to our ambassador in Kyiv and was talking about how we could promote a coup d'etat so our guy would be in charge. How do we know? Because the Russians taped the call and put it on the internet. You can hear it. And I always wondered, you spend $1 billion a year to have secure telephone calls, and she gets on the phone on an open line. Well, anyway. Now, one thing we did in the interim, which was not very smart, incidentally, we did some other things that tended to isolate the Russians. In 2001, we abrogated the ABM treaty. Well, so what? Didn't matter anymore. Cold War was over. No nuclear confrontation. ABM treaty, that was something done a long time ago, except for one thing. It was one of those few little things that this puny little country, Russia, could still feel like they were a grown-up country. It was a dumb thing to do. Similarly, by putting missile defenses in Central Europe, obviously not against Russia, they wouldn't work. Why would we put them in Central Europe? Against Korea and Iran. I'll let you people do the geometry on that. I've never quite figured it out. And then at the NATO summit in 2008 in Bucharest, there was an effort to get for Georgia and Ukraine a step towards NATO membership. Nobody in Europe wanted to do it because they said, defend Ukraine? What do you mean, go to war for Ukraine? Go to war for Georgia? I'd rather go to war for Montenegro, but not for Georgia. And so in order, because the president wanted it and all that kind of stuff, they cobbled a little thing and said, Georgia and Ukraine will become members of NATO, meaning out there in the sweet Neverland. Well, I saw that immediately. I was across the street at the time. When you say they will become members of NATO, that's the moment of commitment. Nobody wanted that. They didn't believe we're doing it. The president of Georgia thought he had something going, so he poked the bear with a sharp stick. At the same moment, the Chinese were having this wonderful Olympics, and so Putin decided he had to have something, so he went into there. And also with regard to Ukraine, and I said, I sure as hell hope he doesn't do something with Ukraine. Well, all these things happen. All right, now, where are we going from now? A number of things. NATO is back to having to do things in Europe against what Russians have done, and have done a lot. You heard a lot already today. In fact, I think enough, I hope I'm right, to be what we call a tripwire. Bob Bell mentioned earlier, we could never have defended Berlin. We had enough folks there that if you wanted to push across the boundary, you'd have to kill some Americans. And when you kill Americans, we get our dander up. And they always understood that during the Cold War. Well, we've done an awful lot in Europe now, an awful lot. I'm not so sure our Polish friends yet agree with that. You'd like us to do a bit more, and maybe we will, who knows. But so we've done a lot of responses. Now, a few other things before I close. How far will NATO go beyond Europe or just a regional alliance? There are a lot of different perspectives within the alliance of doing things and not a lot of common interest. There should be more, but a lot doesn't exist. We have major differences on the Persian Gulf, where everybody wants Iran not to get the bomb. And we worked out under the last administration a wonderful name, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which stopped everything on a nuclear side in Iran, going on for another 12 years, something like that. And for certain and everybody supported it. And it was negotiated by us and the Germans and the Brits and the French, the European Union, and the Russians and the Chinese, along with the Iranians. Last year, the president took us out of the JCPOA, which I think was not a smart thing to do. Well, all the allies disagree with us on that. That's going to make things difficult. None of the allies want to see a war with Iran. I'll let you on what I believe to be a secret. I could be wrong. President Trump doesn't want another war either. Whatever he may say, I think he knows the American people don't want another Middle East war. And I think he's correct on that. At least I hope not. What happened in Afghanistan and what has not worked in Afghanistan, I think, has led a number of allies to say we don't want to get involved in another one of those, which again speaks to doing out of area. There are major differences on the handling of the Arab-Israeli so-called peace process, which right now doesn't exist at all. There was the Turkey issue we've already talked about, which is going to get worse before it gets better. where in the one circumstance we had earlier, what if when Turkey was working with us in Syria and against ISIS, if Turkey had been attacked, could it have invoked Article 5 and asked for everybody to be involved there? Well, people used to say, what if Turkey and Greece go with one another? That could be Article 5. And we used to say, don't worry, we'll handle that. And both sides knew that. And there's no interest, frankly, in helping out in Asia, which is going to be a problem. Now, a couple of things. Brexit, which is now postponed until, it was supposed to be on Halloween, which would have been wonderful yesterday. It's now been postponed until the end of January. As much as anything, it's about the internal structure of British politics. I think it's nuts, but it's going to have a major impact on security in Europe because the Brits play a major role, not just in NATO, but to help keep the peace, political peace between France and Germany, for helping out in Central Europe. The only person, other than some people in the British government who are really happy about Brexit, the only person is Vladimir Putin, because that's going to weaken things. Well, there you go. Also, we've had problems with democratic practices. We've seen this all over. It's been mentioned before. When we took countries into NATO, there was an effort to create some kind of institution for disciplining backsliders. It was vetoed by the Clinton administration. We wish we had it now. The current American ambassador was the one who proposed it. Didn't work. There are a couple of countries who will remain nameless who are less than democratic today. I'll mention one of them is Hungary, and there's some others. And that's a problem for a democratic-based institution. Final point, the Russian interference in domestic politics. I don't think there's any doubt that they tried in 2016. I don't think there's any doubt that they are trying to do it in 2020. I don't think there's any doubt they're doing it in other countries. The Soviet Union used to do it all the time. These folks are doing it. Oh, by the way, we sometimes do it ourselves. We've done it some 85 times since the founding of NATO, but that's all right. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys. We helped keep Italy and France from going communist in the late 1940s by doing certain kinds of things. I helped Italy from going, including the Euro communists in 1978, by helping to do certain kinds of things, which are probably still classified, but that's all right. The Italians will forgive us. They're very forgiving. But I will say it is extremely doubtful that what the Russians did in 2016 was decisive. That depends on the assumption that the American people are stupid. And I don't believe that. I don't believe that. I think it's more likely the Democratic candidate ran a rotten campaign. And plus the role of elites, looking down on what were called the deplorables. As soon as that remark was made, I said, well, there goes the election. That's another matter. You don't ever say things like that. And it's not true to begin with. People have interests, and people know what their own self-interest is. It's one of the foundation stones of democracy. And politics is all about reconciling differing interests. Now, it has become impossible in this country, however, to talk about a decent relationship with Russia. And a fundamental fact, Russia cannot be isolated. Russia is going to be a serious power, not a superpower again. Demographics, a lot of other things against it. And we have to find a way to work to, as George H.W. Bush said, not to isolate the Russians. It's become impossible now, and I may as well say it, for two basic reasons on my side of the aisle. Because it was a way of explaining why Hillary lost. It's also a great cudgel with which to get rid of Trump. The whole Mueller investigation, fine, okay. It's a great, very convenient, but it means, and I recommend you go back to the president's press conference in Helsinki with Mr. Putin. Read the press conference. Don't just read what the media said about it. Read it. And I don't think you'll come to the conclusion that President Trump was siding with Putin. He wasn't. In fact, Putin made a number of good recommendations which we couldn't take up. Well, we're going to have to come to terms with that. We must not lose arms control. We've already lost the Intermediate Range Forces Treaty. We've lost the ABM Treaty, which didn't matter. The SALT II, the New START treaty, is coming up in a year and a half for renewal. That is vital to get that renewed. We've got to find a way of doing that. And most important, we have to avoid a new Cold War. What's a Cold War? Cold War is when you and an adversary can't distinguish between what you can negotiate on and what you can't. You can't negotiate on anything. And once you fall into it, then a whole apparatus comes into being. Psychological, military, political apparatus. And getting out of it is terrible. I would say this. I think the Cold War could have come to an end a lot sooner than it did. But we had this apparatus. In fact, it started to come to an end in the middle of the 1960s when we came up with MAD, mutual assured destruction, the most colorful acronym ever. Rigidities, we've got to avoid that. Tasks, the following. U.S. commitment, keep the Allied commands, sort out Turkey, sort out NATO, EU. And a great opportunity would be at that NATO summit to have a parallel European Union summit and have a joint declaration of principles. Not going to happen. Turks won't let it happen. Greeks won't let it happen. And our government won't let it happen. And frankly, the last 3 administrations were too dumb to let it happen. All right, where I started, the successor generation. Making this work in the future, just as making our country work in the future, is the work of every generation. And you younger folks here, I have great confidence in it because what I've seen here the last 2 days of the people of Troy and the other universities, I think America's going to be in very good hands. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. That's as comprehensive a view as I've heard in a while. Very refreshing, too. We appreciate you providing that. We have time for some questions. So anybody who would like to engage the ambassador on any of the topics that you've heard today or in his speech, please identify yourself. We'll get a microphone to you. It was comprehensive. Well, we have a couple of questions right here, sir. You wanna...
Is there a correlation in memberships? Is there a correlation in membership between NATO and the European Union? Yes. Almost all, except for, well, there are a few. Norway decided not to join. Iceland is not in. The Republic of Ireland isn't in. In fact, when we were putting NATO together in 1949, we asked the Irish if they wanted to join, and they said, sure, as long as Britain doesn't. So we chose Britain instead of Ireland. And the British are soon not going to be in the European Union, but in general it corresponds. But they're two very different organizations. One is a multinational organization of sovereignty of individual countries, NATO. The European Union has a lot of common institutions of taking decisions together. Does the European part of NATO have the fortitude to stand up to Russia? I think the answer is yes. I think the answer is yes. I could be wrong, but I think the answer is yes. And I think the people here who serve in Europe with their European counterparts would probably agree with me. Not every country would be there now, but if the pressure got going, then the historians are going to come out of the wall and they're going to say, wait a second. Remember what happened the last time. What has to be done to tighten up, renew the NATO alliance? Lots of things, most of which are now being done. One thing would be, and this is the most important thing, other than Brexit, which I have no authority over, would be to stop the ambivalence in the United States among anybody in the administration or in the opposition about the United States' firm commitment to European security and to NATO. Stop it now. Because psychology matters so much, and when people get scared about being left to the tender mercies either of history or what migration might do or what the Russians might do, you don't want to have any ambiguity. That's a terrible thing. How many former USSR countries are not in Europe? That's a very good question. You could look at it kind of the other ways. Let's say the 5 Central European countries, The three trans-Caucasian countries are not. Moldova, Ukraine, and that's about it now, isn't it? Are there any others? Maybe, maybe not. One of the wonderful things, when they had the 50th anniversary meeting in Washington, the president had a White House dinner. So many people there, they had it on the lawn with marquees and all that kind of stuff. They had a huge head table, which included everybody who was either an ally or a partner. 44 of them sitting across from one another. 12 of those heads of state sitting there had been members of the Soviet Politburo. Well, horses for courses, people change. Okay, some of them are still run by the same dictators with their families. With its closer ties to Russia and defense, is Turkey still an effective part of NATO? No. Question is how much of a problem it is and what you do about it. You can't throw them out. There's no provision for doing that. If they were starting to do something which really mattered, there are things you can do. For example, during the period from 1967 to 1973, when Greece was run by the colonels, who were basically fascists, I guess it was, couldn't do anything about it, except that in military affairs and other affairs, there were certain documents that for some reason got mislaid on their way to the Greeks. So I would say one of the most important problems, and I hope we go into it tomorrow, is what does one do to straighten out that relationship with Turkey? One reason it got as bad as it did, two reasons. One is Erdogan sees himself as a successor to the Ottomans. And number two, Turkey tried for many years to join the European Union. The European Union led them down the garden path. They started negotiations all, year after year, and it was an absolute lie. They were never going to have Turkey in the European Union. Turkey, wanting to be desperately a European country, is now deciding under Erdogan, maybe we'll just go on and do as much as we can to run the Middle East. Those are the questions I have here.
Thank you, sir. Any other questions? We're right here. Hold on just a minute.
Thank you for coming and speaking with us today. I wanted to ask, so we discussed earlier there, Dr. Hampton discussed an institutional approach and where we dropped the ball in the past about integrating Russia into the European community. I don't know if that's the appropriate term or not, but
With a small c, yeah, that's the right word.
With a small c. What can we do now, I guess, looking at the long-term plan? Because obviously right now the short term is make sure Russia doesn't, try to assert their power too much into Europe. What would be the long-term plan of maybe trying to bring Europe into our fold?
Bring Russia into our fold. Well,
I'm sorry.
doing exactly what we're doing at NATO today and in Central Europe, and making sure that Mr. Putin knows he's gone as far as he can go and get away with it. As far as he can go and get away with it. That includes dealing with cybersecurity, energy, anything else he may get up to, and blocking him at every pass. Now, on the other side, communications. You won't believe this, but there's one area in which we and the Russians communicate every day, probably as we are right now. It's in Syria. The United States Navy and Air Force communicates constantly with the Russians there to make sure we don't run into one another. Military people are very good about that. They're not stupid. If they're going to risk their lives, they don't want to do it because they weren't talking to somebody. One thing I found at NATO when I was there, I don't know whether Bob Bell had this experience, diplomats keep everything close to their chest because that's the gold standard. Military people share everything with everybody. And I said to myself, what's going on here? And I said, because if you don't share information, somebody dies. Okay? So that's number one. Communicate, including directly with the Russians in Europe. Reinvigorate the NATO-Russia Council. All right, so they make a bunch of speeches. Who cares? Don't care about the speeches. I want to see what they do out in the hallway. Another area in which there is good cooperation, you're not going to believe this, the Arctic. When we did what we did after we had to do with what he was doing in Crimea and in Ukraine, we took a decision, the United States government took a decision to fence off the Arctic in terms of cooperation. We and the Russians cooperate all the time there. And yes, they've been increasing what they've been doing militarily up there, but it's still nothing compared to what they had in the Cold War. And yes, there'll be competition. Maybe the biggest competitor we're going to have in the Arctic is China. One impact of the most serious threat we face today, bar none, climate change, most important. The Arctic's melting. The Northern Sea route is coming open. Ships are now passing there. There's a cruise ship. I actually sailed on it at one point. I actually went through that thing. Can you believe that? There's not many places you can stop and shop while you're up there. We cooperate. The part of the U.S. government that most argued against confronting the Russians up there was the United States Coast Guard. We have 1.5 icebreakers, the United States. We're now building a second one, heavy-duty one. We rent the Russian icebreakers and the Finns when we need them. We have scientists up there. The Russians have scientists. They use our equipment. We use theirs. We exchange information. Too important, and also what central to certain other kinds of things. Carry on with that. Arms control. Very important on arms control. Very important, I think, also to have a more, if that's the right word, robust set of conversations on the Middle East. If we wanted to, the Russians could not outclass us in the Middle East. In fact, in some regards, they're welcome to certain things. I won't name which ones they're welcome to. I'd get in political trouble. Cooperation with regard to Iran. A great present we made to the Russians was getting out of the JCPOA. Go back into it. I mean, the best thing to trammel Iranian military nuclear programs, that's what it was. President probably figures, well, there's a lot of years before they could actually do anything, but not smart. I could probably come up with and I'd go back to the NATO-Russia Founding Act, and I'd take the 19 areas of cooperation, and I'd look through and see which ones we could revive. But most important is to make sure that we have the kinds of communication to prevent the hardening of a Cold War. Because once you get that apparatus going, then it becomes a felony to talk in public about wanting to change things, almost. Because we have to deal with them. We're still the big enchilada. They're not a superpower. We're still a big enchilada. We still have more of the cards in our hands. And let's not be intimidated just because Putin and company make more noise and have taken advantage of certain kinds of things. We can make the running if we want to do it. And any president can do it who wants to do it. This gentle lady here.
During the last campaign, there was a lot of rhetoric, political rhetoric against NATO by President Trump, who kept on pushing isolationism. Is there concern what's going to be said, the impact that might be said during this campaign that's happening now that will impact NATO? I mean, President Trump has been impeached, but that doesn't mean he's not going to be running for president.
Well, he hadn't been impeached yet. Well, that's why I mentioned on the 16th of December, the president has a chance to straighten this stuff out by getting up there and saying, he just has to say, we support Article 5, that's it. Now, when he was at NATO at the dedication of the new headquarters, which looks like Battleship Galactica, if you want to see it, it's right out of Star Wars, and he was accused of not ratifying Article 5, he said afterwards, well, wait a second, the whole ceremony was about Article 5. Okay? Well, that was kind of a weak-handed thing. He has a new national security advisor, whose name I bet you don't even know, who had an article the other day in the Washington Post who in effect said, without saying it, I'm not John Bolton. I'm going to keep my head down. I'm not about making policy. I'm about coordinating policy. And if we could just get Mr. Pompeo to declare for the Senate, and we get somebody else in, because he is not always saying the most useful thing. Because the deep state, which is 98% of the government, that is people with their heads screwed on straight of both parties, believe in NATO. In the United States' fundamental national interest. Not because we love them necessarily, but because without it, we would be in very deep trouble. And incidentally, one of the things people often forget, it buys us a tremendous amount of influence. Stuff we want, not just in Europe, economically, politically, elsewhere, at the UN, because we're the big enchilada committed to NATO, and with that strategic commitment, we get an awful lot for that, cheap at the price. And you don't want to erode that, because then life might get a lot more difficult. And you'll find, incidentally, American private sector has no doubt about it. They want NATO to be strong, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think the president was, I hope he was just playing a game, but he has a chance to correct things. Because I'll tell you, I might as well say this, if he gets reelected and still is ambivalent about NATO, then we will have a really big problem. If he gets reelected, but he straightened this out in advance, we may have some other problems. I'll let you decide for yourselves. We wouldn't have one in regard to NATO. This is critical.
Not to go beyond the scope of the conference, but one of the key areas of international cooperation between the U.S. and Russia particularly is the International Space Station and the separate but possibly closely related and highly classified topic of weaponization of space by ourselves and Russia respectively. Do you see this as an opportunity, an avenue, if you will, to improve relations with Russia, or do you see it alternatively posing a risk of escalation that could go much farther than it currently is?
Well, you're thinking about the future. I forgot to mention space cooperation. Did you know that to put people in space, we depend upon Russian rockets? Now, they could put castor oil in them, and cause them to malfunction if they wanted. They don't. We cooperate with the Russians on that. That lab that's going on up there, very important. With regard to the militarization of space, I'll say something that may make my Air Force friends here happy. I think the creation of a Space Force is stupid, because they will want resources. They'll want to have all of this and all of that, and they'll want to have their own doctrine, and they'll want to be different from the Air Force and everybody else, and they'll want to argue for this and that. It's like I oppose the creation of AFRICOM. The American forces in regard to Africa, were lots of places, were part of the European command out of Stuttgart. Now they have their own command, and they got their own place, and they got their own flag, and they got their own resources and all that kind of stuff. Every time you create an institution, it's going to want to do something. Now, what we do need to do with the Russians and with the Chinese and everybody else that sets them is start some kind of process going to rule that out of bounds, if we can possibly do it. There's enough smarts to do it. There's enough technology to do it. And I think if we allow that to go down the road where we do have genuine military cooperation in space, we're going to regret it ever happened. And so will the others. So will the others. We're going to be ahead of the others. If it comes to a military space race, we're going to win it. But waste of time, waste of money, and waste of danger. It's something to be working on. Maybe Bob Bell could write a thesis on this. Not going to touch it.
Hey, sir. I'm an intelligence officer stationed at Maxwell Air Force Base.
That's why you're not in uniform, aren't you?
That's right. Yeah. My
You're
question.
hiding. You're
I don't
hiding.
know. My question is back to Turkey. We talked about how we can't really kick them out, but could they leave, and could they do that without us realizing they already have, and would they tell us that they're not really in NATO anymore?
Oh, they would never do that, because they lose their seat at the table, in which they could do in the Greeks if they wanted to, in anything else anybody wanted to do. And it also helps them be a big power, because they're part of the big alliance that matters. So I don't expect them to do that.
they have anything to lose by leaving, I guess, at this point? Or what would they lose?
I think they would lose access to American military equipment. We've already disciplining them with regard to the F-35. When they find that the S-400 anti-aircraft system of the Russians is not as good as the stuff we have, I think they'd feel very lonely. They would also, quite frankly, as one looks at the congeries of relationships out there, that would leave them to the tender mercies of the Russians. And their membership in NATO is an ace in the hole. And they also, in my judgment, don't want to go too far in alienating the United States on a bilateral basis. In fact, what's going on in Syria today, with the genuine desire of the president to reduce our footprint in the Middle East, I'll let you decide whether that's a good thing. It's a good argument to be made for it. I wonder whether the President Erdogan, cut a deal. Everybody wants to see the transcript of the conversation with the president of Ukraine. I'd like to see the transcript of the conversation with Erdogan, or maybe done at a different level. There's a lot to be sorted out there. And I don't want to get into the situation with the Kurds, which one could, but it's immensely complicated. I think the Turks would lose a lot if they did that, and I think they know that. They're one of the allies that plays within the parameters of the alliance for individual gain, as the French did for a long time. The French always knew, even though they left Allied Command Europe, that by the time the war got to France, they could come back into it. And in fact, during that period, this is a good historical lesson, when they got out in 1966-67, the French never left the NATO Integrated Air Defense Command, because that might have to come into being in 24 hours. They never left it. They didn't close down the NATO oil pipeline. And incidentally, when we were in Bosnia, when they agreed to go to Bosnia, they were as good as an ally as anybody. If the French agreed to do something, they do it. Their military loves a fight, among other things. And when they get involved, they stick to it. There are one or two other allies I could mention, I didn't say Britain, that will agree with this and then nickel and dime us to death. The French will nickel and dime us until they agree, and then they fulfill what they said they're going to do. So I think, but this is, if you want an issue to focus on right now that you're going to have to, with all the complexities of foreign affairs, this would be a good project for some of the students at the university here. Take on the Turkish issue. One last thing that had a history, they were against our going into Iraq in 2003, very much against. And I remember a CIA briefing after it, and they said, we've done an opinion poll in Turkey, and American popularity in Turkey has dropped to 9%. He said, and we can't figure out who the 9% are. Got to have some humor in this business. You go nuts.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think we're at the end of our time. I would let's give a big hand to Ambassador Hunter. I think he's, as you can tell, he's a gracious gentleman. He'll be around for any individual questions you might have afterwards. As we close, let me just remind you, we'll have a shuttle outside for taking people back to the hotel right after this. We, again, tomorrow will start at 9:30. Breakfast will be available from 8:30 on. Here, a continental breakfast. There is a free lunch tomorrow, so if you signed up, so please join us for that. And we'll have a pretty full schedule, starting with a panel that I will lead on hybrid and cyber threats to NATO, a panel on NATO's current regional operations, and one on future threats to the Atlantic Alliance. And then we'll close tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock with the closing address by His Excellency George Christian Maior, the Romanian Ambassador to the United States. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and we look forward to your continued participation tomorrow. Thank you.